Hey, folks, from Mesa, Arizona, and Boone, North Carolina, and Colorado, Windham, Vermont, Hillsborough, New Jersey, Danvers. You know the secret of Danvers, right? That's where the actual um, attacks on the alleged witches were during the Salem witch trials. But Salem was part of, or Danvers and Salem were the same town at the time, and Danvers split off later. I like Danvers, not because of that, but it's a nice town. Memphis, oh, my favorite city, Memphis. Berkeley, California, and Facebook is here, terrific. In Haverhill, Mass. Venice, Florida, Hawaii. This is much more fun than the news, isn't it? So first of all, let me start by saying I'm sorry I misled you. It never occurred to me that people would misunderstand what I wrote. It was a student of mine who successfully defended a dissertation. I defended my dissertation in 1992. So it's been a while for me, and I thank you for your congratulations. But I will pass them on to my student, who is I suspect a very happy person right now, and ought to be. So we're all here, and I will let me start by saying sort of where I am. I am tired. And I assume you are as well, because the stuff just keeps coming over the transom. And as a result, I feel like there's a lot of stuff going on that I'm not calling attention to. And it's not from lack of interest. That is, I have had now for 4 solid days a piece not queued up, but that I've been working on the outlines there and so on, about the United States and its foreign policy and how that applies to what happened with Mohammed bin Salman yesterday, and with the administration's attacks on boats coming out of Venezuela, and even what that may or may not have to do with Russian attack on a Polish railway system last weekend. And you know, every time you sit down, like, this was my day. This was my day to finally get that into print, and then I opened the news, and here we are. So I will do the best I can, but I'm starting to think maybe I should even do these more frequently, just because there's just too much. Anyway, for today, there's a lot going on, and I'm going to start where all of you asked me to start, and that's with President Donald Trump's threats against 6 members of Congress, I think it is, I don't do math terribly well, for a video that they posted on Tuesday. And that video let me just read you what was in it. It was a video by Senators Alyssa Slotkin, who's a Democrat of Minnesota, Senator Mark Kelly, a Democrat of Arizona, Chris Deluzzo, a Democrat of Pennsylvania, Maggie Goodlander, a Democrat of New Hampshire, Chrissy Houlihan, a Democrat of Pennsylvania, and Jason Crow, who is a Democrat from Colorado. Now, they are all former military. There is, or intelligence. Slotkin is a former CIA officer. Kelly was a captain in the U.S. Navy. Deluzzo was also in the Navy. Goodlander was an intelligence officer. Houlihan served in the Air Force, and Crow was a former paratrooper and an Army Ranger. And they did a video that came out Tuesday, and I wrote down what was in it so you could hear it for yourselves. They said, they speak in turns in the video, and they said in the video, "We want to speak directly to members of the military and the intelligence community who take risks each day to keep Americans safe. We know you are under enormous stress and pressure right now. Americans trust their military, but that trust is at risk. This administration is pitting our uniformed military and intelligence community professionals against American citizens. Like us, you all swore an oath to protect and defend this Constitution. Right now, the threats to our Constitution aren't just coming from abroad, but from right here at home. Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders. You must refuse illegal orders. No one has to carry out orders that violate the law or our Constitution. We know this is hard and that it's a difficult time to be a public servant. But whether you're serving in the CIA, the Army, our Navy, the Air Force, your vigilance is critical. Know that we have your back, because now more than ever, the American people need you. We need you to stand up for our laws, our Constitution, and who we are as Americans." And then they end with a very famous American line, "Don't give up the ship." And that, if you don't know the reference there, it comes from a naval battle during the War of 1812. And in 1813, the captain of this ship, this American ship, takes a broadside from the ship is the USS Chesapeake. It's one of the originals, by the way, and in the Navy, and it takes a broadside from a British ship, and it's a really bad broadside, and among other things, the captain of the ship is mortally wounded, and the last thing he says is, "Don't give up the ship." And in fact, the ship does end up getting overtaken by the British sailors and Marines, and that "don't give up the ship" becomes sort of Americans never give up, and it becomes a rallying cry for the rest of the Navy during the War of 1812, and then went on into history as being, "We're never going to give up. Don't give up the ship." And you've heard that again and again through American military history. For example, in World War II, somebody asks for an American resignation or an American surrender, and the answer is simply nuts. That's Americans don't quit, and that's sort of what they were trying to convey there. Maybe more than you wanted to know about "Don't Give Up the Ship," but I love naval history, and nobody ever talks about it. Anyway, in my next life, I'll get to do more naval history. Anyway, so they put up this video, and Trump was busy with MBS yesterday, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and I don't think he saw it, because when I read Truth Social this morning, which is the social media platform that Trump is part of, the real nasty stuff really starts after he appears to see maybe one of two things. The Washington Examiner, which is a right-wing coded newspaper, referred to the video yesterday, and so did Fox News Channel when Jason Crow from Colorado was on it, and he was being interviewed by a Fox News host, and really actually kind of owned the room. And after that, Trump posted and then reposted a number of attacks on those people who made the video, saying that they were traitors, that they had committed sedition, and that then he kind of upped it and reposted, whatever it's called there, retruthed on it. Somebody who said that they should be tried and executed, and he really leaned into that. And that, of course, has caused just an absolute furor, as it should. So what you have here is a president of the United States calling for the execution of those he considers his enemies. And there is a bit of a parallel to that in American history that I may or may not tell you more about now. I will write about it this weekend if nothing else huge happens. But of course, one does not want the president calling for the deaths of lawmakers. This is really, really completely unacceptable. And what's happened over the course of the day has been really interesting, because the Democrats who've been attacked have made a joint statement, and then they have made individual statements saying, "Don't give up the ship. We're gonna become the face here of resistance to this regime." But also a number of Democratic leaders who were not either in the military or part of this video have said, now is it, the jig is up. It's time to pick a side. You can't really play this down the middle any longer, you Republicans who are trying to make this go away. And I have been out straight all day. That is very busy all day. So I have not thoroughly read the news. But to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I have not seen a Republican taking a stand against this. And that's really interesting. And I'd be really surprised if no one does. Certainly, White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt tried to say, he didn't really mean it. It doesn't matter what he's up to right now. That was simply unacceptable. And should it get him impeached? Sure, it should. But is it going to? I don't know. Probably not. But let me walk you through that for a little bit, because there's a lot of things I think that are really interesting going on today and perhaps yesterday, and really for the last several days, this Epstein losing on the Epstein issue has tied President Donald Trump into absolute knots, and you have to always keep in mind that he is not mentally okay. I mean, somebody has commented that his lack of inhibition in the calling for the execution of Congress people is indicative of a stage of dementia. And I'm not a doctor. I don't remember what it is, but you can tell that he has lost any sense of inhibitions. He's just saying whatever he wants to say. But I think there's more things going on than that. It feels, like I say, things feel very different to me, really, since Jimmy Kimmel, really, but certainly taking off over the loss of the ability to hide the Epstein files, at least as far as we know right now. And what I mean by that is that the reason that the vote for the bill requiring the Department of Justice to release the Epstein files within 30 days of the passage of the bill. The reason that that was a big deal is because it showed that Trump had lost control of the Republican Party. And that's not to mean entirely, he's not completely out, but they have moved in lockstep with him since really 2018. When by 2019, as we know, in his first impeachment, even all the Republican senators, according to Ted Cruz, believed he was guilty, but they voted to acquit him because they cared about keeping his voters behind him and they wanted to win the 2020 election. And then similarly, after his second impeachment, after the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, Mitch McConnell said, the Democrats will take care of him for us. We don't have to go out on this limb. And so they acquitted him. Not all of them did at that point, but he did not, not all voted to acquit him, but he was acquitted of both of those things. And they've really stayed behind him because they've wanted his voters, and that has enabled him to be sort of the Teflon president, that they just got behind him and repeated whatever he said, and they kind of tried to create their own reality. But when Republicans turned against him over the Epstein files, it demonstrated that they were no longer his to command, at least on that specific issue. But as I've said before, he's in real trouble on a lot of issues. He is badly underwater in terms of his popularity, in terms of how people think he's doing his job, in terms of how they think he's handling the economy, in terms of how they think he's handling deportations. He's had military officers and federal agents in U.S. cities, which nobody likes, and he is increasingly isolated and increasingly seemingly unable to figure out ways to get his base back, to the point that when he did an interview with Laura Ingraham on the Fox News channel within the last couple of weeks, he found himself defending himself and saying, I'm MAGA. I'm the one who invented MAGA. I'm the one who knows what it is. And he really looks as if he is losing his control of the party. So if you think about his lashing out the way he did, both at the Congress people today, but also at the Reporter, I think you can see somebody who is very, very concerned about his power slipping away. And he knows that it's happening. And now I'm going to do a little detour into the quiet piggy comment, because that's important. And because it ties into this other thing, I think, as well. So what happened on that was they were on Air Force One, and a report, and there was a press gaggle. Now, he's an interesting character because he always talks about how terrible the press is, how much he hates the press. He calls them the fake news or whatever, but he is desperately press hungry. He's always talking to the press. That's why it was such a big deal when he went missing over Labor Day, is because that man talks to the press whenever he possibly can. And he was doing what's called a press gaggle. They were on Air Force One, and you can see it, by the way, it's online, and they were asking him questions. And this woman, this female journalist, asked him about the Epstein files. And what was really interesting about that, it's worth going back and taking a look at it, is he flashes into fury and goes, quiet, piggy. And that was a really interesting moment if you watch it, because people who like him, that we call narcissists, really tend to have three channels: rage, charm, and self-pity. And I have always read that he goes through all of those things. We certainly have seen um, the self-pity, which is there all the time. But, if you've read former Vice President Kamala Harris's autobiography, The 107 Days, which is a better book, by the way, than the reviews suggested, she says that he calls her at one point, and he is so charming that she's like, oh my God, I'm falling into it. I get it. He is so charming when he wants to be. So there's the charm. But the rage we have read about and not seen. And in that flash, you can see the rage. And remember, he's a big man. He's an imposing man. And so I thought that was really interesting. I also thought it was interesting that he went for the term piggy, which is, it's an old-fashioned insult. And, many people are talking about the fact he applies those sorts of insults to women, which is true. But it was a very old-fashioned insult. Think about it. I mean, when was the last time you heard someone called piggy? Like that was sort of almost a World War II kind of insult, which, the only person I ever heard it really do it, not, and certainly never in anger or anything, or is that my father used to use that word. And he was born in 1915. So I thought that was a really interesting word that he used. And you wonder if it was something he heard as a child, because his father might have used it as mine did. I think they were somewhat contemporaneous. So I thought that was a really interesting flash of a lack of self-control and fury, and perhaps sort of reaching for the meanest thing he could think of, because that's what he'd heard as a little kid. I don't know if that's true or not. And that's just me imagining, so maybe not. But I thought that was really interesting. And it suggested that he had lost control, that he did not know how to handle the Epstein files. And this was his way of going about trying to reassert control in a certain way. But I think you saw this as well, that sort of franticness in today's messages, which were, we can't let this stand, and even a reference to the idea that George Washington would have hanged these men, and which is just anything he says historically, just discount it. That's my friend Joanne Freeman had a great comment about the historical nature of it, and she said, and plus George Washington wasn't out of his mind, which I think is probably accurate there. But it is a crisis. This is a crisis in that we've got a president calling for the death of elected officials. And you can't, they're trying to walk it back, but you really can't walk it back. And there are many things that will come out of this. But before I get into those things, I want to talk about a little bit more about what might be going on here. And that's that I'm not going to belabor Trump any longer. He is, as you know, his mental acuity is not good. His numbers are in the toilet, all that stuff I have said before. So let's set him off to the side. But remember, he is really what managed to hold together that group of MAGA believers, true believers, who want to dominate women, people of color, want to be, have a hierarchical society in which they are at the top of it. And that's not necessarily, some of those people actually have money, but it's not necessarily a reflection on people who actually are dominant. Sometimes it's people who want to be dominant. And this is why you have the sorts of people you saw at the Unite the Right rally, or that you saw at many of Trump's campaign rallies. So Trump could marry those people to the establishment wing of the modern Republican Party, which, by the way, the entire Republican Party is so far to the right of where the Republican Party has ever been, that you can't really, people say conservative Republicans, and boy, did that ship sail. That ship sailed in the 1990s. In today's thinking about the government, Dwight Eisenhower, who was one of the most successful Republican presidents of the post-war years, would have been considered so far to the left he couldn't get elected as a Democrat, right? So the Republicans are way over there. And actually, if you look at what political scientists study, you will see that, that the Democratic Party has basically not moved at all, that it has stayed pretty much a center to a slightly center-left party. It looked like it took a little bit of a left turn in the 70s, but that's because the Dixiecrats, those segregationist Democrats, moved into the Republican Party, and they're the ones who have gone so far right there over the cliff. Anyway, Trump married the MAGAs to those establishment Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who simply wanted to get rid of popular voting and wanted to concentrate power in a very small people and really put business in charge of the country. But what has happened in the second Trump administration is that Trump has the guardrails are gone, and he doesn't care about those establishment people any longer. That is, he wanted some of their money to get into power, but what he really did is he married himself to the tech bros, who are not part of that established Republican base. They, in fact, like Trump, want to destroy the existing system because they want to replace it with a different kind of ideology, in the same way that the MAGAs want to replace it with a different kind of dominant ideology. They both want domination, but they want it for very different reasons. The tech bros want it for themselves largely, although some of them are very religious. The MAGAs tend to want it for religion. But that it makes for a really, really uneasy coalition. And what's happened in the second Trump administration is that coalition has torn itself apart. So in the Republican Party, you have, among other things, you have coming to the light now, you have the Senate Republicans and the Senate Democrats at each other's throats. And you can see that in, for example, the fact that the House Speaker Mike Johnson, and Trump clearly thought they could get the Epstein files through the bill through the House because they could get it bottled up in the Senate. And the Senate took one look at that. The Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, is a Republican from South Dakota, looked at that, and he permitted Chuck Schumer to call, and probably asked him to call for a measure that would mean that as soon as the bill got to the Senate, it passed automatically. So Republicans would not have to go on the record for or against it. And if you saw those videos of House Speaker Mike Johnson being questioned about it after the fact, he was incredibly flustered and he was incredibly upset. And he was like, it needed amendments. It needed amendments. He was hoping they would bottle it up with amendments and the thing would get talked to death and it would never appear. And Thune was like, no, let's pass it. And that, of course, put Trump in the bind of having to sign it and so on. But you can see, and then the House, in turn, is pitching a conniption fit over the Senate's insertion of the measure into the continuing resolution to fund the budget of allowing the senators whose phone logs were looked at completely legally, by the way, because of their connection to the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol, to sue for that. And the House is like, and again, there's another great thing. The Senate puts it in, but they didn't include the House. So all the House members were like, what's going on here? And then they're fighting back against the Senate. So you've got a split between the MAGAs who run the House and the more established Republicans in the Senate. And that's not to say there aren't some of each in both, but they're starting to come apart. And you can see that, I think, most dramatically in the fact, and it got almost no press, and it was really important, that last Friday, I think, I've been on the road, I've completely lost track of time. You can Google when it was. To a Democrat, Jared Golden, a Democrat from Maine, and I'm forgetting the name of the Republican from Pennsylvania, and I should have it in the top of my head, and I don't. Together, they had put forward a measure in the summer. They'd put forward a measure together to protect the unionization of federal workers. And the House Speaker Mike Johnson refused to bring it to the floor. So they wrote a discharge petition I think it was in August, and it was 2 votes shy of getting signed, which is, doesn't count. 2 votes short is nothing. And after the Epstein vote, 2 Republicans from, I think they were both from Virginia, New York, joined on. So that's 2 discharge petitions that will force including the Epstein one. This is another one that will force the House Speaker to pull forward a measure that is really quite popular, the idea of union protections for federal workers. So you can start to see the Democrats and the Republicans start. No one's singing Kumbaya yet, but you can see places where they are coming together. And one of the things that Trump was probably doing, at least subconsciously, when he put forward those comments today, was to try and make sure that the Republicans no longer felt safe working with the Democrats, that this would, this is his way to blow up any kind of potential coalition. So that is one of the things that's going on. But now there's something else that's going on in that Republican coalition. And for those of you who don't know who I am, which is no problem, I do study the Republican Party. I study political parties in general, but like I know the Republican Party incredibly well because I wrote a major book on it. So when I say like this is going on in the Republican Party, I'm not just guessing. So the other thing that's going on is the Republican Party under Donald Trump. Remember, he staffed all the places with his own people, and he has forced into office. And the Senate went along with this. The Republicans in the Senate went along with this, which surprised me, with his own loyalists. But the problem with that is Trump's loyalists have a Nazi problem. And that Nazi problem runs through a lot of the MAGA coalition. And for all that the established Republicans wanted those votes, they don't want to be associated with the Nazis. And that is partly principled, I think, having not talked to any of them, but watching them, but also, of course, because they don't want to alienate their Jewish donors. So they're looking at the Nazi stuff that's going on and tearing their hair out. And this is where you can see this in the big fight over the fact that Tucker Carlson, a right-wing podcaster, interviewed Nick Fuentes, who is the leader of the Groypers, and the Groypers are openly, Fuentes has spoken admiringly of Hitler. He is openly racist and sexist, and he thinks that the people, the more established Republicans, are not going far enough, and that many of the people, even in Trump's administration, are not going far enough. And so Tucker Carlson interviewed him and gave him a major platform. And that came right after the Young Republicans had that big thing about their private chat where they were talking about admiring Hitler. And there was a Republican who had a staffer who had a swastika over an American flag in his room. And now today, the Coast Guard has announced that, I think it's Coast Guard. Yeah, the Coast Guard has announced that nooses and swastikas will no longer be considered hate speech, which is just, come on, what are we doing here? So you can see this especially out of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. And just FYI, it is still the Defense Department. They want to call it the Department of War, but the Congress has to make that change. They're changing all the signage at a cost of what looks to be as much as $2 billion, but it is still Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, no matter what he wants to call himself, until Congress makes that change. And it's the Defense Department. Anyway, you can see him really pushing this white nationalist stuff, and you can also see it in, for example, the exclusion of refugees from many, many countries, with the exception of South Africa, where they are being welcomed. And you can see it in a number of things, but you can also see it in all these sorts of policies. But the other one that I wanted to emphasize, because you asked about it, was the policy that came out recently from the Department of Education, which is a whole different kettle of fish, what's going on over there. But they changed the definition of what is considered a professional program. And a lot of you have asked why nursing, physical therapy, what else did I write down? Nursing, physical therapy, and physician's assistants and physical therapists are no longer considered professional degrees from the Department of Education. And that's a couple of things going on there. One is the Department of Education is trying to cap the amount of money that people can borrow for higher education. And if by defining these as not professional degrees, the cap is lower. But if you listen to all of those things, they are coded female and often coded people of color. Whereas the things that are professional degrees are coded male, although with one really interesting exception. They are coded male and they are usually coded white, which is, it certainly seems as if this is an attempt to, to strip out of professional employment and to make them unable to afford that education, people of color and women. Now, one of the interesting things, and I have not done a deep dive in this and almost certainly will not, but in their list of professions that appear to be coded male is veterinarian. And the trick to that, and I know a little bit about this for something that has nothing to do with any of this, is that veterinarians now are a majority female, which is interesting. The switch in that is something that people study because of how and why it happened. And my guess is they don't know that, or maybe they do, and I'm just observing something that isn't there, because it looks that way to me. Anyway, you asked why that was, and I'm going to go back now to the Republican Party. They are really making it very clear they want the United States of America to be white and male, and for the rest of us to live in positions of subordination to white men. And you can see that in any number of places, but it is very much part of the ethos of the Department of Homeland Security, for example, ironically, because it's got a woman in charge of it. But their posters and their signage and their words are very reminiscent of the Nazis in Germany in the 30s, and the policies like this, the many ways in which they're trying to make it really, really hard for people of color and for women to participate equally in society. And I'm going to go a step further and point out that while we are not talking nearly enough about it, the laws against reproductive freedom are literally killing women because they cannot obtain abortions when they need them for their health. And there was a big article in ProPublica within the last couple of days of yet another woman, one of many, who died because she couldn't obtain an abortion, and she got preeclampsia and she died. And that really is a war on people who are not male, right? So you have that going on in the Republican Party, that sort of Nazi problem. And the people who don't want to be associated with that because they recognize that it will simply destroy them with the voters. So over this, and I'm sorry, and here's a couple other problems. You've got the problem of the fact these people are freaking incompetent. The people that Trump is putting in office. I wrote last night about Lindsay Halligan, who is prosecuting or trying to prosecute James Comey, the former director of the FBI. And, she had never tried a case before. She was an insurance lawyer and not an experienced one. And, apparently she's just messed this up 16 ways from Sunday. So you also have that problem because you're going to have, as a person who's thinking about a political party, because then you're going to have to deal with all the incompetence. Just today, a judge ruled that the deployment of the National Guard in Illinois was illegal. I'm sorry, not in Illinois, in Washington, D.C. was illegal, although the judge has given until December 11th for that to be challenged. You're going to see more. You're seeing more and more and more legal challenges that are falling apart. And then you have the issue of corruption. And the issue of messing things up and corruption. You have the report today out from Carol Leonnig and Ken Delanian that there is a grand jury investigating, a federal grand jury investigating Bill Pulte, who is the guy who came up with the mortgage attacks on a couple of people that Trump is trying to take down, including Adam Schiff and sorry. It's been a very long week. Anyway, Bill Pulte, and there's one other person there too. This is just going to get thicker and deeper. So you have all of that going on, and Trump, I think, madly trying to get these people back by making them afraid. If he's going to go after, Alyssa Slotkin, he could come after me. I'm not going to work with those people. But, I just don't think it's going to work. I think that if you look at the feeling in the country right now, do you see Americans suddenly saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to go back and support Trump because we're afraid of him"? I mean, in the past, he has been able to make people afraid or make people love him, but now people just disdain him. The whole fact that the quiet piggy has turned into memes and videos and people making fun of him, and I don't see that working. I really don't. But the question going forward is, to my mind, is how do we make this end quickly with hurting as few people as possible? Um, I'm gonna channel my Thomas Paine here and say it is going to end. It really is, because humans care about self-determination, and the United States of America has a long history of self-determination, and the American people are awake again, and they care about those things, and they care about their democracy. We are going to succeed, but the faster we do it, and the more we can protect from damage as we do it, the better it's going to be. The fewer people are going to get hurt, because for all the things feel like the economy is teetering now, the Republican policies haven't kicked in yet. I mean, that's the kicker to all this. We're really looking at these things. Remember, they pushed them out so that most of the things that were going to happen would happen after the midterms. We haven't seen the cuts to SNAP yet. We've seen SNAP not being funded, but we haven't seen the dramatic cuts to SNAP. We haven't seen the cuts to Medicaid. We haven't seen those cuts triggering Medicare as they might. We haven't seen what happens when we get more and more job losses. We haven't seen all this stuff yet. It's still going to hit. And it would be really nice to have the kind of policies in place that created in October of 2024, just a year ago, a world where The Economist was calling the American economy the envy of all the world, and promising that it should continue, that it was expecting that it would continue just a year ago. Anyway, so what are the options that could happen here? And that is, what else do I have written down here? Okay. And that is, a lot of you have asked about the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. And I wanted to actually read a little bit of the 25th to you, because it's not that easy, the 25th. And I've talked about it before, because the 25th comes from Eisenhower, really is the one pushing it. Everybody thinks it was after JFK got shot, but it's really Eisenhower, because in wartime he had seen a leader who was not mentally at the top of his game, and he killed a lot of people. And Eisenhower wanted to make sure that if that happened for him, that somebody took control and made things safe again for the American people. So the obvious thing about the 25th is that if the president goes, the vice president becomes president, which had not been spelled out before, which is quite interesting. I could tell you stories about after Lincoln's assassination, that being the first one, but that is there. And then the president will nominate somebody if the vice president, if the vice presidency becomes empty. Because for years, if something happened to the vice president, that just sat empty. And then Section 3 says the president can say to the head of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives in writing that he or she feels that they are incapable of discharging the powers and duties of the office. And if that happens, the vice president steps in. But here's what everybody keeps asking about, and that's Section 4. Section 4 is really very messy, especially in this case, because Section 4 says when the vice president, all right, now remember, in this case, the vice president is J.D. Vance, who does not have an independent voting base. He's trying desperately to pick up Charlie Kirk's people, but that's pushing him, and to keep those younger people. But they're going further right. They're going into that Nazi adjacent stuff. It really looks like Nick Fuentes is picking up a lot of them, which is pushing J.D. Vance way over into a lot of land that a lot of people don't like. So he may not want to get, he want more time to step up before Trump goes. whenever the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive departments, usually interpreted to mean the cabinet, or of such other body as Congress may by law provide. So theoretically, the Congress could write a law saying we're going to put together a team of doctors. I'm not thinking the Congress is going to do that here, but they might. Whenever they do that, when they transmit to the president of the pro tem of the Senate, the head of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president takes over. But then, when the president transmits to the head of the Senate and the head of the House of Representatives his written declaration that no inability exists, he resumes his powers unless so you can say, no, I'm fine, and this would be something like you're undergoing treatment for something and you're not for 2 weeks, you're not going to be able to make good decisions. Then you can write and say, I'm all done, I'm good, and then you're back in office. Theoretically, this is certainly the way that somebody like Eisenhower thought about it. He shall resume the powers and duties of his office unless the vice president and a majority of either the principal officers of the executive department, generally assumed to be the cabinet, or of such other body as Congress may by law provide, transmit within 4 days to the president pro tem, to the head of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. Okay, so the president says, I'm fine. And this the majority of the people, the cabinet and the vice president say, nah, he's really not fine. Then, thereupon, if that happens, Congress shall decide the issue, assembling within 48 hours for that purpose, if not in session. If the Congress within 21 days after the receipt of the written declaration saying, no, he's not okay, or if Congress is not in session within 21 days after Congress is required to come back in and assemble, if it determines by 2/3 vote of both houses that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the vice president shall continue to stay in office. If they don't, if you don't get the 2/3 vote, the president's back in. So, I'm seeing a lot of calls on social media for the 25th Amendment to be enacted. Sure, Google it, because that shows up in algorithms. Put your weight on that one. But I don't see Attorney General Pam Bondi and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Education Secretary Linda McMahon. He has, going along with this, he has staffed his cabinet with incredibly obsequious loyalists. So I'm not sure that's the pressure point. A more interesting pressure point right now is Congress, because those cabinet officers, they don't have to answer to voters. And when Trump's out of office, none of them's ever going to have a job again, really, do you think? Although it certainly looks as if Marco Rubio is going to be running for president. I think that's going to be a pretty heavy lift, to be honest. But what about members of Congress? Because the other place where you can put pressure is on members of Congress who in the past have refused to vote to either impeach Donald Trump in the House or convict him in the Senate because they wanted to keep his voters. But right now, what's he got to offer? He is hemorrhaging voters, and he is the economy is not going to woo anybody back. And you got these Epstein files hanging out there. And I maintain that there's something bad in them for Trump to be this upset about them. So I think when I look at it, the pressure point here to try and reclaim our country is Congress, is to force Congress finally to take a stand against this man. But what does that look like? What does that look like to actually make that happen? Pressure. Calling people, showing up, doing everything you're doing, protesting, including more and more people in this movement to get rid of this completely out of control president and administration. And you can see increasing pressure from the courts. You can see increasing pressure from the media, in part because the lawsuits against the media have gone nowhere. You're seeing it from more and more people speaking up. But in this moment, one of the things that this morning's meltdown from Trump on social media, calling for the execution of Congress members, has done, I think, in spades, is it has really illustrated that this is not about Democrats versus Republicans. It really isn't. It's about people who care about democracy, who care about the idea that our government responds to us, not to Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or any of the other people that are making money off it. By the way, somebody asked what on earth is going on with ICE when it actually doesn't seem to be accomplishing anywhere near what the administration is demanding of it. Think of all the money that is in ICE, all these contracts that are going to Trump loyalists to cosplay in Chicago. There's a lot of money behind that. And I, for one, am sick and tired of my tax dollars going to people in ICE rather than to feeding kids and to education. And it's our money and it's our government. And the more that we emphasize that the reality is the partisanship of the last many years, not just Trump, but before that, really all the way back into the 90s and even back into Reagan, was really fostered on the part of this radical group of Republicans who tried to divide the American people so that they could funnel money upward, which they did really dramatically, more than $50 trillion from the bottom 50% of Americans to the top 1% of America, top 1% of Americans. So recognizing that what we are doing right now is not fighting for a political party. And by the way, the number of people who are unaffiliated right now in the United States rivals the numbers of people who think of themselves as Democrats or Republicans. But what we need to do is build this coalition that says, listen, right now we are fighting to maintain American democracy. And what that looks like to me in terms of policies might look very different to you in terms of policies. But what we can agree on is that we don't want a president who threatens to execute elected lawmakers for saying things which are not only protected by the First Amendment, they are reinforcing the law. The law is that service members cannot obey an unlawful order. And they use that word. They say that. They don't say, the radical right is trying to turn this into they're saying that you shouldn't follow, lawful orders. That is not what they said. That's why I read it. So in this moment, what we are doing is we are reclaiming. Really, it's really interesting the degree to which we are reclaiming the ground on which we stood in the American Revolution. The idea that in that era where most of the colonists who lived in British-ruled colonies had very little in common with each other. They came from different countries. They spoke different languages. They had different customs. They were trying to do all sorts of different things together. They had different religions. That was a really big thing. But they recognized that they had more faith in being able to rule together, to figure out how to rule themselves as a group, than they had faith that a bunch of people on a distant land who had their own interests in simply extracting resources from them would govern them fairly. And the language that we are using, the no kings even, for example, looks so much like that moment. And it also looks like the 1850s when the Democrats and the Whigs fell apart because the elite Southern enslavers, the Democrats in the American South, very different than the Northern Democrats, but they tried to take over the government quite literally and turn it into an oligarchy based on a hierarchy in which a very few white men ruled. And a lot of white men, because of course white men were the only ones mostly who could vote in that era, they didn't care at all about Black rights, and they certainly didn't care about women's rights or indigenous rights or Irish or Chinese rights, by the way, because those were on the table in that era as well, and Mexican American. Those were that because the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there was actually a bit of a difference between those two things, um, but they didn't care about those rights. But what they did say is, we don't agree with each other about internal improvements or about finance or about immigrants, but we can agree we don't want to turn our country over to this small group of elites who are determined to make us, at best, work for them, become part of that mudsill class. And you see the same thing in the 1890s when you had this attempt to create this fervent partisanship in the United States, but instead what we got was a lot of people saying, I might not even speak your language, but both of our children are eating milk that has been adulterated with formaldehyde and chalk, and they're getting sick from it. Or in that era, they literally painted, there was no Food and Drug Administration, of course, at all. So people who sold candy would literally paint candies with lead paint. And kids would lick it, and of course, they would get terribly ill. That's where the idea of not taking candy from a stranger comes from. Of course, in the modern era, it's got a different meaning, but you didn't want your kids to be eating candy from a stranger, because if they bought candy from that looked beautiful and started licking it, they could be licking lead paint. People looked at that and they said, we may not agree with each other about immigration or about race or sex or any of these other things, but we'd like to protect our kids, and we'd like to make sure we don't turn this nation over to a really small group of robber barons who are just taking everything that we have. Our ability to get an education, our ability to make money when we work, our ability to live healthy lives, our ability to have family lives. We don't want to turn that all over to a very small group of robber barons. And I could say the same thing again in the 1930s, when we had a period in the 1920s where the government gets turned over to business. And after you look at the election of 1928, when Herbert Hoover is elected in a landslide to continue the turnover of government to business. And it looks like the world has disappeared, that it's all going to be ruled by a very small group of very rich men. And within 4 years, that has changed entirely, because people walk away from the partisanship and they say they have led us down a path that has concentrated wealth among such a small set of hands that we have the Great Depression. And we must figure out how to come together and create a world that makes us all able to afford housing, so we're not living in packing boxes anymore. And one of the really big reasons that we get things like Social Security is because of a man looking out of his window and seeing two elderly women eating out of a garbage can. And they said, we're going to get behind a movement that enables us to create a world where we don't have to live like that. So when I look around us at this moment, and at a moment when we literally have the President of the United States calling for the execution of lawmakers who are reinforcing the rule of law, I say, we're looking at a time when we very clearly have demonstrated one man who was trying to destroy American democracy. And often when you get the rise of a strong man, he offers something. He offers a better economy, for example. Trump has destroyed our economy. Okay, so he offers better conditions around the country. No, he's cutting into infrastructure. And today they announced they're going to try and drill for oil in California and on the coast of Florida. Well, if you're on the coast of Florida, you need those beaches to be pristine for tourism. So, you look at these issues that are partisan issues according to the lawmakers or the leaders who are trying to drum up votes, but these are American issues. And now is an American moment for us to come together and say, hell no. Are we going to go down that path that Donald Trump is leading us down? Instead, we're going to start to work together and figure out what are the issues that we care about, regardless of party. Because here's a newsflash. The vast majority of us care about things like education and healthcare and housing and higher taxes on the wealthy. If you actually ever look at polls in issue areas as opposed to individuals, very, very clear um, majorities, strong majorities, not 51%. I'm talking 68% in favor of these policies, including things like getting rid of partisan gerrymandering. 68% of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, don't want partisan gerrymandering. We have to take these issues back and create a world where we'll never again have to wake up and see a president threatening to execute people that we have elected to office. So in order to do that, keep speaking up, keep thinking about the stuff you want. And I'm going to add something to that this week. Cheer on those members of Congress who are walking the walk. And that doesn't just mean the ones that are in your face. That means one of the things that has come out in a recent poll is that Americans don't trust Congress. They don't think it does anything. Congress does a lot. And it doesn't get any coverage really in the legacy media because they're always focusing on the president and the, sort of the easy actors. So if your Congress critter's doing something good, call it out. If you're and call it out on social media, call the office. I mean, certainly call to complain too. But let's build up those people who are doing the things that we like. And just for the record, you are not going to like anybody 100%. I don't like anybody 100%. But if they're speaking out on issues that matter to me, I'm going to stand behind them because that's the point of electing people you care about to Congress. You like to Congress. And you know what? If you don't keep liking them, elect someone else. But now is our moment as the American people to reclaim this country. And I think what Trump did today outlines that you really can't stand in the middle any longer, that you got to take a side. And I don't see any reason why we wouldn't take the side of the American revolutionaries and Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt and the progressives and FDR and Harry Truman and Eisenhower. Those are all the periods in which this country did the best. Why on earth would we decide to side with the Confederates, the people who admire the Confederates and the Nazis? Anyway, I went on way too long today, but it's kind of an important day. And I probably won't have a lot of energy to do a lot in a letter tonight because I've been on the road for a week and I just got home. But anyway, thank you for being here. And I mean, they teed it up, so I have to do it, right? Don't give up the ship. I'll see you soon.